evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Tavis Smiley's been on TV for a long time, but he had his show suspended last week by PBS after PBS says it received, quote, credible allegations of sexual misconduct. Smiley admits to having relationships with several of his employees at the company, but he says he's not a harasser. He's never groped or coerced anyone. He also says PBS never gave him the chance to respond to the anonymous allegations against him. Meanwhile, on CNN this weekend, former Obama spokesperson Jen Psaki said that all accusations of sexual misconduct should be presumed true without exception.
There are false accusations out there. It does happen. Even the most liberal, most progressive advocates for women against sexual violence concede that point. Is an accusation enough?
Yes, it is enough. I completely agree that in the time we're in right now, this is going to be perhaps a bloody period. But, I mean, the fact is that Democrats and the Democratic Party cannot be, here you have a waiver. We have zero tolerance, but.
That's the state of play. Tavis Smiley joins us tonight. Tavis, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tucker.
So what specifically did PBS accuse you of doing when they yanked your show off the air?
It's hard to know. The clause in my contract that they originally suggested to me they were looking into, this is sort of inside baseball. It's clause 5.1, which is the morals clause. We all have morals clauses in our contracts. The clause that they invoked when they pulled the plug on the show was clause 9.1, which is the clause that allows them simply to decide not to distribute my show anymore. In other words, they told me that they were suspending me under clause 9.1, but they told the press basically that I'd violated clause 5.1. So PBS to this very moment has not told me specifically what I am being suspended for.
So they issued a statement accusing you of some non-specific sex crime, in effect. You don't know what that is? You don't know who's accused you of this, and you don't know the substance of it? I
do not. PBS launched an investigation without telling me about it. I found out about it in the streets when former colleagues, Tucker, of mine, started calling me to tell me they were receiving strange phone calls, asking strange questions from some investigator, asking questions like, did Tavis ever make you feel uncomfortable? Are there other persons we should talk to? And so they started letting me know about these calls. That's how I learned of this. I contacted, of course, my attorneys. My attorneys reached out to PBS and these investigators, and for weeks, my attorneys offered for me to sit down at any time, place, or point to answer whatever questions they might have. They rejected that invitation for weeks, only under the threat of lawsuit. Our suing them, did they agree to finally sit with me for 3 hours and to talk to me. And in that 3-hour conversation, I was never told what the accusations were, who the accusers were. I was never allowed to provide any data or evidence to debunk anything that perhaps I could have debunked if I had known what we were talking about anyway. But they wouldn't allow me to present any evidence, and they, frankly, didn't give me due process. And on top of that, they have, to this moment, not talked to anyone on my current staff, not my COO, who was in charge of HR. It's mind-boggling to me that they've sort of kind of had this, played this game of pick and choose of who they actually want to talk to. And all these persons they've talked to are former employees, some of them who were terminated. I've been at this 30 years. When you're in business that long, you hire people, and some people get fired, but they won't talk to, for whatever reason, my current staff or the person in charge of HR to just ask very simply, did Tavis ever instruct you to make any workplace decision based upon his relationship status? The answer is no, but they won't even ask those questions.
So do you know where the original complaint came from, or even if there was an original? So you don't know how this started.
No.
You don't know who's making the accusations.
I don't know how it started.
You don't know what the accusations are.
No.
So what did you talk about for 3 hours with their lawyers?
A bunch of vague questions, sort of what if this, or might you have ever done this, or it was basically a bunch of what if scenarios. No specifics, no places, no times, no real data for 3 hours. It was the most frustrating thing ever. I mean, I'm a conversationalist, but it's tough to have a 3-hour conversation without knowing what you're really talking about.
What should the process have looked like, do you think?
I mean, I certainly understand. That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked, Tucker. I certainly understand in this moment why any network would be concerned about these kinds of allegations, and they ought to be looked into. My complaint is the way that PBS has gone about this, not even telling me that a complaint had been lodged against me, never telling me they were starting an investigation, refusing for weeks to even speak to me, again, not talking to my current staff. There are any number of things that could have been done here, and they've just bungled this. And as I said, they made a huge mistake. They've engaged in a sloppy investigation, and something needs to be done to fix this.
So you've said that you had romantic relationships with people who worked for you.
Over 30 years of being in this business, yes.
Over 30 years.
Yeah.
Is that against, well, first of all, is that a wise idea? And second, is it against the rules?
At worst, it is misjudgment. Over the years, I've learned. I've been at this, again, 30 years, and so there are things that I might have done 30 years ago that I might not do now, not because it's illegal or immoral or unethical, but just because it might represent bad judgment. As you know, I've written 2 books in my career talking about mistakes I've made and lessons I've learned along the way. So, of course, there are many things in my life that I've done in the past that I might not do today, but it does not rise to the level of this kind of public shame, this kind of public humiliation, this kind of wrongful termination, and this kind of personal destruction.
What do you think this is about? I mean, why did PBS do this, do you think?
Whenever something like this hits the media, there's always more to the story than meets the eye. And I don't want to say much more than that because my attorneys are hard at work. There's a lot more behind this. I did say earlier today that it's strange when you finally get this 3-hour meeting and within an hour and a half after that meeting ends, they pulled the plug on the show. Clearly, when we went into that 3-hour meeting, PBS had already made up its mind without having talked to me early on in the investigation process, without having talked to my current staff. They had made up their mind. And so about 90 minutes after this meeting ended, we got the letter that they was temporarily, or indefinitely, I should say, is the exact language, indefinitely suspending my program.
Right.
And 12 minutes after that, this exclusive story broke in Variety. So I asked, how does an exclusive story break 12 minutes after we were informed that the plug was being pulled? And in that story, there are quotes from unnamed sources, presumably inside of PBS. Persons close to the investigation is the phrase they use. They had enough time to research my background, so there's background material about me in the story. There are links they placed in the story. I assume an editor looked at this before it went online. But all that was done inside of 12 minutes. Now, you tell me whether or not there's an agenda here.
Yeah. Well, so do you think the rule ought to be that you're not allowed to date your subordinates? Should that be allowed?
I certainly understand that there are persons who believe that there is no such thing as a consensual relationship in the workplace. I hear that. I even respect that point of view. But there are other opinions on this. In my employee handbook, we do not encourage inter-office relationships, but we don't forbid it either, because I don't know how things are going to turn out in your life when you start hanging out with our company. I don't know who you're going to meet. And let's face it, nobody's working 40-hour weeks anymore. We're working 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. Where else are you going to meet people? And this business, our business itself, is full of people, producers and talk show hosts who met on the job. So clearly there are millions of Americans who met their spouse at work. So I just don't think I have the right to tell people who to date. The problem here is that we're starting to criminalize legitimate relationships between consenting adults, and that's a real problem for me. And if this can't be resolved some other way, and if this does, in fact, end up in court, millions of taxpayer dollars are going to be spent by PBS to defend itself, and I don't think the taxpayers want their money spent that way.
I've never agreed with you on very much, Tavis, but I have to say I agree with a lot of what you just said, and I appreciate your coming on tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tucker.